My name is Lucas Reed. I'm 36 years old, and for the past decade, my life has been a predictable cycle of hard labor, cold beers, and restless nights. I work construction, sun up to sundown, breaking my back to pay the bills. It's not a glamorous life, but it's mine. Or at least it used to be. I don't know when things started to shift between me and Mara. Maybe it was after I started taking extra shifts to keep us comfortable. Maybe it was something else entirely, something I didn't see coming. What I do know is that she's been different for months now. Distracted, distant, and every time I reach for her, she feels just a little further away. Tonight, I came home later than usual. My hands were sore, my body ached from the 14-hour shift, and all I wanted was a cold beer and maybe a warm touch from my wife. But as I pulled into our driveway, my stomach twisted. Her car wasn't there. Again, I let myself into the house, the quiet pressing in on me like a weight. The place smelled like lavender and fresh laundry, Mara's signature. It should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like a lie. I kicked off my boots, leaving dust and gravel scattered across the linoleum, and headed for the fridge. That's when I saw it. Her phone, left unattended on the counter, its screen glowing with a notification. Girls' night group chat. Can't wait for tomorrow. Best weekend yet. I stared at the words, my mind racing. Girls' trip? She hadn't mentioned any trip. Not to me. Not lately. Something in my gut twisted, an instinct I couldn't shake. I hesitated. I shouldn't look. I knew that. But the need to know outweighed the guilt gnawing at my conscience. I reached for the phone, swiped the screen open, and started scrolling through the messages. It took less than a minute for my world to collapse around me. There, in the middle of the conversation, was a photo. Mara was smiling, radiant, beautiful, and she wasn't alone. A hand rested on the small of her back, a hand I recognized instantly. A silver ring gleamed on his finger, catching the dim light of the kitchen. My breath stalled in my chest. My head went light. I knew that ring. It belonged to my brother, Damon Sullivan. My pulse roared in my ears. My fingers tightened around the phone as I scrolled further. Texts, plans, declarations of love, mentions of hotels. Chicago, last weekend. A weekend I thought she had spent with her friends. Lies. Every word, every excuse, every distant glance. It all clicked into place like some sick puzzle. My hands were shaking. I set the phone down, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The sound of tires on gravel made my spine stiffen. Mara was home. I moved fast, retreating into the garage before she could see me standing there, frozen in betrayal. I needed time. Space. I needed to think. My heart pounded like a war drum as I grabbed a wrench and bent over my motorcycle, pretending to work while my mind spun out of control. The garage door creaked open behind me. Lucas? Her voice was soft, hesitant. I forced myself to breathe, forced my hands to relax before I crushed the wrench in my grip. In here, I grunted, keeping my voice neutral. She stepped inside, her silhouette framed in the dim light of the doorway. Everything okay? I nodded, not trusting myself to look at her. Long day. Thought I'd tinker for a bit before dinner. She hesitated. I felt her eyes on me, searching for something. Maybe she could sense the shift, the storm brewing beneath my skin. But she said nothing. A moment later, I heard her footsteps retreating, the door clicking shut behind her. I exhaled shakily and gripped the wrench so tight my knuckles turned white. She had no idea. No clue that the foundation of our life had just crumbled beneath her feet. And I had no idea what the hell I was going to do next. My hands were still shaking when I finally left the garage. The wrench felt like dead weight in my grip, my knuckles sore from clenching it too hard. My mind kept replaying those messages, those pictures, Mara, my wife, in Damon's arms. My own brother. The thought alone was enough to make bile rise in my throat. I forced myself to breathe. I needed to be smart. I needed to think. If I stormed inside, screaming and demanding answers, I'd lose. She'd lie. She'd twist things. Maybe even cry and beg. Or worse, she'd gaslight me, make me feel like I was the crazy one. No, I wouldn't give her that power. I had to know everything. That night, I barely slept. Mara lay beside me, oblivious to the war raging inside my head. She was curled up like she always did, breathing softly, her body radiating warmth under the blanket. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. How long had it been going on? Weeks? Months? Years? Had it started when I was working overtime, breaking my back to give us a better life? Had Damon pursued her first, or had she thrown herself at him? I clenched my jaw, swallowing back the anger. It didn't matter. Not yet. What mattered was knowing every detail before I made my move. By the time the sun peeked through the blinds, I had a plan. Mara left for work at 7:30, same as always. I watched from the window as her car backed out of the driveway, my stomach tight with dread and disgust. As soon as she was gone, I moved. Her phone had been a goldmine, but I needed more. Something concrete, something undeniable. I started with the basics, her drawers, her closet, the nightstand. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Then I moved to her laptop. Locked. But I'd seen her password before. I wasn't supposed to know it, but I had caught a glimpse when she typed it in once. I hesitated, then entered it. Access granted. A flood of emails, texts, and notifications hit me at once. I navigated to her messages, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. There they were. Conversations between Mara and Damon, stretching back months. Mara, I miss you. Can't wait for this weekend. Damon, me too, baby. Lucas has no clue. Does he? Mara, none. He's always working. Too tired to notice anything. Damon, good. Because I don't want to share you anymore. My chest ached with something I couldn't quite name. Betrayal. Humiliation. Rage. I scrolled further. Hotel bookings. Photos. A trip to Chicago I never knew about. It wasn't just a fling. It wasn't a mistake. They had planned it. They had built a life behind my back. And they thought I was too blind to see it. I closed the laptop, exhaling slowly. My pulse was pounding, but my head was clear. Mara was meticulous, but Damon was reckless. He always had been. The kind of guy who thought he was smarter than everyone else. The kind of guy who left evidence behind. I had one more place to check. His apartment. That evening, after Mara fell asleep, I left the house. I told her I was going for a drive to clear my head. She didn't ask why. Damon lived downtown in a sleek high-rise apartment. Fancy. Too fancy for his salary. The bastard had always lived above his means. I parked down the block and waited. At 11:15, I saw him leave. Some blonde was on his arm, giggling as they walked to his car. Not Mara. Another woman. Figures. I waited 10 more minutes, then I moved. Breaking into a place like this wasn't exactly easy, but Damon and I had grown up together. I knew how he thought. I knew he never set his security system when he was in a hurry. I picked the lock in under a minute. Inside, the place was exactly what I expected. Sleek, modern, soulless. But I wasn't here to admire the decor. I was here for evidence. I started with his desk. Bills, paperwork, junk. But then, tucked in the back of a drawer, I found them. Bank statements. Large cash deposits, made regularly. Shell company names. Fake invoices. Damon wasn't just screwing my wife. He was laundering money. My heart pounded as I flipped through the documents. The amounts were staggering. Hundreds of thousands, maybe more. He'd been at this for a while. And if I could find it in 10 minutes, the authorities could too. I snapped photos of everything. Every document, every transaction. Then I put them back exactly as I found them. Before I left, I did one more thing. I placed a tiny hidden camera in the corner of his living room. The kind of thing you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. If he thought I was oblivious before, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. By the time I got home, it was almost 2 a.m. Mara was still asleep, tangled in the sheets. I stood there for a moment, watching her. I used to love her. God, I used to love her so much. But now all I saw was a stranger. I slid into bed beside her, my mind racing. I had enough evidence to destroy them both, to ruin their lives the way they had ruined mine. But revenge wasn't enough. I needed them to suffer, and I needed to do it right. Because once I made my move, there was no going back. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my own reflection. The man looking back at me wasn't the same one from a few weeks ago. His eyes were harder, darker. I ran my hands over my face, feeling the rough stubble on my jaw. My body still ached from another long shift, but the exhaustion barely registered anymore. The weight on my chest was heavier. Mara was in the kitchen, humming softly as she made coffee. I could hear the clink of her spoon against the ceramic mug, the same sound I had woken up to for years. But now it felt foreign, unfamiliar. How could she carry on like nothing was wrong? How could she sip her coffee and smile while I lay awake at night, replaying the images burned into my mind? I turned on the faucet, letting the cold water run over my fingers. I wanted to believe there was still a way back, that maybe this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew better. She had made her choice. Now, I had to make mine. I left the house early, telling Mara I had to run errands. She didn't question it, just kissed my cheek and went back to her coffee. If she noticed how tense I was, she didn't let it show. The truth was, I couldn't be there. Not with her. Not with the lies thick in the air, suffocating me. Damon's apartment had already given me some answers, but I needed more. The hidden camera I planted had been running all night, and I had a feeling it had picked up something useful. I parked a few blocks away and pulled out my laptop, connecting to the live feed. The screen flickered for a second before an image came into view. Damon was there, pacing his living room, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was tight, agitated. "No, I told you, the money is clean. No one's looking at me. Just stick to the plan." A pause. I don't care if he's been asking questions. Lucas is an idiot. He wouldn't suspect a thing. I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around the laptop. Idiot. That's what he thought? That I was too blind to see what was happening right in front of me? Damon ran a hand through his hair, sighing. Mara's been acting weird lately, though. I think she's getting paranoid. Keeps asking if we should tell him. Tell me? Tell me what? That they were in love? That they were planning to run off together? Or was there something even worse lurking beneath the surface? I needed more. I wasn't proud of where I was headed next. The Rusty Nail was the kind of place where people went to disappear. It reeked of old beer and desperation, the kind of scent that clung to your clothes long after you left. Wade Mercer sat in his usual corner booth, a whiskey glass sweating in his grip. He looked up when he saw me and smirked. Well, haven't seen you in years. What brings you down here, Reed?" I sat down across from him, ignoring the stale scent of cigarettes. "I need some answers." Wade raised an eyebrow. "And what makes you think I got him?" I slid $100 bill across the table. He chuckled, shaking his head. "You always knew how to get to the point." He pocketed the cash. "All right, what are we talking about?" "Damon Sullivan." His smirk faded. "Shit, you don't want to get involved with him." "Too late." Wade exhaled, tapping his fingers against his glass. "Your brother's been playing a dangerous game, laundering money for some serious people, moving cash through fake construction contracts. If he screws up, they won't just ruin him, they'll bury him, and anyone close to him." I felt my stomach tighten. Damon wasn't just a liar. He was a walking time bomb. How long has he been doing this? "Couple years at least," Wade said. "He's gotten cocky, stopped covering his tracks like he used to. If someone were to say, nudge the authorities in the right direction, he'd go down hard." I nodded slowly, standing up. "Appreciate it." Wade gave me a knowing look. "Whatever you're planning, make sure you don't get caught." I walked out of the bar, my mind racing. Damon had built his own downfall. I just had to give it one last push. Back at home, Mara was setting the table for dinner when I walked in. "You're late," she said, smiling. "Busy day?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, but I was thinking, maybe we should take a weekend trip. Just us. Get away for a bit." Her eyes lit up. "Really?" "Yeah," I said, wrapping my arms around her waist. "I'll take care of everything." She leaned into me, sighing. "That sounds amazing. I think we really need it." I nodded, holding her a second longer than I needed to. She had no idea that this trip would change everything. Damon was next. That night, I slipped into his apartment again. I planted fake evidence, texts on a burner phone, a briefcase full of cash, a few numbers scribbled on a notepad that would make it look like he was running the construction site thefts that had been making headlines. Then I made an anonymous tip. By the time the cops put the pieces together, Damon would be a dead man walking. 2 days later, Mara and I packed our bags. The car ride was quiet, a tension hanging between us that she didn't seem to notice. Halfway to the cabin, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her face going pale. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "It's Damon. He says the cops are after him. He thinks someone set him up." I reached over, squeezing her hand. "Hey, don't worry. We'll figure it out." She nodded, still shaken. I have a bad feeling." I smiled. "Me too." She had no idea just how bad it was about to get. By the time we reached the cabin, Damon had already called her 3 more times. She ignored the last one, her nerves on edge. As we settled in, I watched her closely. She had no clue that I had orchestrated everything, that I had built a trap so perfect, so airtight, that there was no way out. Damon would go down. The money laundering, the fraud, it would all be pinned on him. And Mara? She would realize too late that I had known all along, that every kind word, every touch, every moment of fake forgiveness had been nothing but a game. Because by the time this weekend was over, she wouldn't just be dealing with a ruined life. She'd be dealing with me. And I wasn't the man she thought I was anymore. The cabin stood quiet and still, nestled between the towering pines. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh wood, a scent I once found comforting. Now, it felt suffocating. Mara shifted beside me in the passenger seat, her fingers toying with the hem of her sweater. She hadn't spoken much since we left home, only glancing at her phone every few minutes as if waiting for news she wasn't ready to hear. I killed the engine and turned to her. "You okay?" She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, just tired." Lies. She wasn't tired. She was unraveling. I could see it in the way her hands trembled when she reached for the door handle, how her shoulders tensed as she stepped outside. She felt it. The shift. The unspoken tension between us, thick as the fog rolling over the mountains. I grabbed our bags and followed her inside. The cabin was warm, the golden light from the fireplace flickering across the wooden walls. Everything was just as I had planned, cozy, inviting, a perfect illusion. Mara set her purse down on the kitchen counter, then turned to face me. "Lucas, Her phone buzzed. She hesitated before picking it up, and I watched as the color drained from her face. "It's Damon," she whispered. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "What does he want?" She swallowed hard, reading the message aloud. "Damon, I think someone set me up. The cops are after me. Please, Mara. I need you." Her fingers hovered over the screen. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for something. Permission, maybe, reassurance. She wouldn't find it. Instead, I reached for the wine bottle on the counter and poured myself a glass. "And?" Her voice wavered. "Lucas, we have to do something. He's..." I took a slow sip, letting the silence stretch. "He's what?" Her lips parted, but she didn't seem to have an answer. I set my glass down with deliberate care. "You're worried about him?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Of course I am. He's in trouble." I tilted my head, studying her. "And why is that our problem?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. There it was. The hesitation, the fear creeping in as she realized I wasn't reacting the way she expected. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Tell me something, Mara. If I was the one in trouble, would you fight this hard for me?" Her breath hitched. I watched the war play out in her expression. The guilt, the panic, the desperate attempt to find the right words. But there weren't any, because we both knew the answer. Mara barely ate that night. She picked at her food, her mind elsewhere. I let her sit in her silence, let her thoughts consume her. She thought she was in control. She thought she could still fix this. She was wrong. As the fire crackled in the hearth, I stood and stretched. "I'm going to step outside for some air." She nodded absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed on her untouched plate. Outside, the cold bit at my skin. The sky stretched dark and endless above me, stars scattered like shattered glass. I pulled out my phone and made the call. The line clicked after 2 rings. Anonymous tip line. I lowered my voice. Damon Sullivan. Room 212. Moonlight Motel. A brief pause. Your name? I smirked. Just a concerned citizen. I ended the call and exhaled, watching the breath fog in the air. Inside, Mara sat curled up on the couch, hugging her knees. She looked small, fragile, like a child waiting for someone to tell her everything would be okay. I walked back in, locking the door behind me. She lifted her head. Lucas, I need to ask you something. I raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. She hesitated, then whispered, How long have you known? I leaned against the wall, my fingers tracing the edge of my glass. Long enough. A tear slipped down her cheek. I'm sorry. I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the deep red catch the firelight. No, you're not. Her breath hitched. I took a step forward, then another. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry things didn't go the way you planned. I stopped inches from her, tilting my head. But you're not sorry for what you did. She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. Don't insult me by pretending. She choked back a sob, wiping at her face with trembling fingers. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I chuckled, shaking my head. You didn't mean to? That's rich. Silence. She stared at me, and for the first time, I saw it. The realization settling in, the shift in power. She wasn't in control anymore. I was. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a notification. Breaking news, Damon Sullivan arrested on multiple fraud charges. I set the phone down, watching the sun rise through the cabin window. Mara hadn't slept much. I heard her tossing and turning all night, whispering into her pillow. Maybe she was praying. Maybe she was hoping this was all just a nightmare she'd wake up from. It wasn't. She shuffled into the kitchen, her eyes swollen from crying. Lucas. I poured coffee into a mug and slid it across the counter. Drink. She wrapped her hands around the cup, staring into the dark liquid like it held all the answers. What happens now? I sat down across from her, my fingers drumming against the wooden table. That depends. She lifted her gaze, wary. On what? I leaned forward, lowering my voice. On whether or not you tell me the truth. Her breath caught. You want to fix this? I continued. Then start by telling me everything. Mara swallowed hard, her knuckles turning white around the mug. For the first time in a long time, I saw it. The fear. Good. She finally understood. There was no way out of this. Not for her. Mara sat across from me, staring into her coffee like it might hold the answers she didn't know how to give. Her fingers curled around the mug, gripping it too tightly, her knuckles pale against the ceramic. She hadn't taken a sip. She hadn't looked at me, either. The silence between us was thick, heavy, almost unbearable. I wasn't sure which one of us would break first. She swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas, I don't know what to say. I exhaled slowly, rubbing my palms together. Then don't say anything. Just tell me the truth. Her breath hitched, and for the first time, I saw something shatter in her. She nodded, blinking hard like she was trying to keep herself together. I never meant for this to happen. A bitter laugh slipped out before I could stop it. Yeah? That's what people always say when they get caught. She flinched, pressing her lips together. Good. I wanted her to feel it. To feel all of it. The doubt. The sleepless nights. The gut-wrenching moment when I found the first message. The way my own home had turned into a place I couldn't trust. She had taken everything good between us and burned it to the ground. And now she sat there, clutching a cup of coffee like it was going to fix any of it. She inhaled shakily, her voice barely a whisper. You were always gone, Lucas. Always exhausted. And I felt like I was alone? I cut in, my voice sharper than I intended. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. I let out a slow breath, dragging my hand down my face. You think I wasn't lonely too? Her head snapped up, her red-rimmed eyes wide. I let out a hollow laugh, shaking my head. You think I didn't see what was happening? That I didn't feel you pulling away? I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees. I thought we were going through a rough patch, that if I worked harder, gave us a better life. We'd come out on the other side of it. I exhaled, my chest tightening. But you didn't wait, did you? She closed her eyes, squeezing them shut like she could block out my words. I wasn't trying to leave you, Lucas. I studied her, my jaw tight. But you thought about it. She didn't answer. Didn't have to. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment, letting the truth settle in. She had thought about leaving. Maybe she hadn't planned it. Maybe she had told herself it was just temporary. But somewhere along the way, she had considered it. And that was enough. Finally, she spoke, her voice raw. I don't expect you to forgive me. I laughed softly, shaking my head. Good. I swallowed hard, my throat thick, because I don't know if I can. A tear slipped down her cheek, and for the first time, I saw something break in her. Real regret. Not just because she got caught. Not because she was afraid of what came next. But because she knew. She had ruined something we couldn't get back. Hours passed before she spoke again. Damon called me. I didn't react. Just took a slow sip of my coffee. Yeah. She hesitated, watching me carefully. He says someone set him up. I raised an eyebrow. And do you believe him? Her lips parted, but she didn't answer right away. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I don't know, she admitted finally. I want to, but I don't know what's real anymore. That was the first honest thing she'd said all night. I pulled my phone from my pocket and slid it across the table. Call him. Her breath hitched. What? I leaned forward. Call him, Mara. She stared at the phone like it might explode. Lucas, why? I didn't raise my voice. Didn't move. I just waited. Her hands shook as she picked up the phone, hesitating for only a second before dialing. The line rang. Once. Twice. Then his voice. Mara? Damon's voice was tight with panic. Jesus, where have you been? You're not answering my texts. She swallowed. I'm at the cabin. A pause. With him? Yes. Silence. Then, in a hushed whisper, Mara, listen to me. We have to go. Now. The cops. Someone set me up. My accounts are frozen. I need you. Her grip tightened on the phone. She looked at me, and I saw it. The moment she realized she had a choice to make. Damon was waiting for her to say she'd meet him, that she'd run. But for once, Mara didn't know what to say. And then, finally, she whispered, I can't. What do you mean, you can't? Damon's voice sharpened. A tear slipped down her cheek. I'm sorry. A bitter laugh came through the speaker. You're sorry? She flinched. Damon exhaled sharply. Mara, you don't get it. This is serious. I need you to meet me. Before she could answer, I took the phone from her and pressed it to my ear. She's not going anywhere, Damon. A sharp inhale on the other end. Lucas. I smirked. You're in a lot of trouble, brother. Silence. Then, his voice was low and venomous. It was you, wasn't it? I didn't bother denying it. See you soon. I hung up. Mara's breath came fast and shallow. Lucas, what have you done? I knelt in front of her, tilting her chin up so she had no choice but to meet my gaze. What I had to. Her lip trembled. This isn't you. I tilted my head slightly. Maybe it is. Maybe it always had been. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Breaking. Damon Sullivan arrested on multiple fraud charges. I set the phone down, staring out at the thick morning fog settling over the trees. It was over. Mara sat curled up on the couch, knees pulled to her chest. She hadn't spoken since last night. I didn't know what she was thinking. I wasn't sure if I cared anymore. Finally, she whispered, What happens now? I sipped my coffee, letting the question settle in the space between us. That depends. She turned to me, her voice hollow. On what? I set my mug down and looked at her. On whether or not you're still lying to me. Her breath caught. Because we both knew the truth. Some betrayals you could never come back from. And I wasn't sure if we had anything left to save. Mara sat hunched in the armchair by the fireplace, her arms hugging her knees, gazing at the flames as if they contained some kind of solution. The room smelled like burnt wood and rain, the air thick with something neither of us knew how to name. I sat across from her, gripping a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I wasn't sure why I made it. Maybe out of habit. Maybe because it gave me something to do with my hands. She hadn't said a word in hours. Neither had I. Outside, the storm had passed, but the weight of it still lingered. The sky was gray, the trees dripping with leftover rain, the world strangely quiet. "I keep waiting for you to tell me to leave," she murmured, breaking the silence. I glanced at her, my fingers tightening around the mug. "And if I did?" She let out a shaky breath. "I think I would." I studied her carefully. "Do you want to?" She swallowed hard, her eyes flickering toward me. "I don't know." And that was the problem, wasn't it? She had made so many choices. Choices that shattered us. Choices that she had to live with, and yet, even now, she wasn't sure what she wanted. I leaned forward, elbows resting on my knees. "What do you expect to happen, Mara? That we just wake up tomorrow and pretend none of this happened?" Her face crumpled, and she shook her head quickly. "No, I don't expect anything, Lucas." She ran a hand through her hair, exhaling shakily. "I don't even know what to say to you. I feel like every word out of my mouth is wrong." I let out a slow breath, my gaze dropping to the floor. "Maybe there isn't a right thing to say." She sniffled, hugging her knees tighter. "Do you hate me?" I should have. I should have hated every lie, every moment she stole from us, every time she let my own brother touch her. But I didn't. I hated what she did, but I didn't know if I could ever hate her. And maybe that was what hurt the most. I swallowed hard, shaking my head. "I don't know." Her lips trembled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I think that's worse." Maybe it was. Maybe if I hated her, I could have walked away. Maybe if I hated her, this would be easier. But I didn't. And I didn't know if that meant we could fix this, or if it just meant I was too broken to let go. The wind had died down by the time night fell. Mara sat near the window, arms wrapped around herself, watching the trees sway gently in the darkness. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, like a part of her had folded inward, like she was trying to take up less space. I stood in the doorway, watching her. After a moment, I spoke. "Do you regret it?" She didn't turn, but her breath caught. "I regret everything," she whispered. I exhaled slowly, stepping closer. "Then why did you do it?" Her shoulders tensed. "Because I was selfish." Her voice cracked. "Because I thought I wanted something different, and I was too stupid to see what I already had." I clenched my jaw. "And now?" She finally turned to face me, her eyes red-rimmed and full of something raw. "Now, I just want to know if I've lost you forever." Her words hit harder than I expected, because I didn't know the answer. I rubbed a hand down my face, exhausted in a way I didn't know how to fix. "I don't know." Her breath hitched, and she nodded slowly, like she had expected that. But I saw the hope flicker in her expression, the tiniest, fragile thing. And I hated that I wasn't sure if I wanted to crush it or hold on to it.